So I went ahead and I finished off the texturing on this by adding a little more rust, removing some rust, adding a little wear, basically just finessing all the maps that I already showed you. And here we have our final result. As well as the render with the ground, I also have just the model by itself and a couple more views, sort of back view here. Then I have some detailed views, like a detail of the treads, the arms. Here's a view of the back with some of the rust dripping and whatnot. A more frontal view. A view of our the eye sitting there in the robot head. Sort of rear view of the details in the belly section and the rear. And I also went and just quickly did some shots of a turntable, just every 10th frame. So you really get a good idea of what he looks like as from all directions. So when rendering at a turntable, it's okay to do one against black, but you also may want to do one against some sort of gradient or color, simply because you will almost never see a model against black in a real production, and so you'll want to get some better idea of what the model will actually look like in a scene. So you can set it up a turntable with our little ground or some sort of color or something just a little more interesting. And there you go. So I'm going to take this opportunity to show you the final materials that we created and how they relate to the original pipeline. So as you remember, we took our visual details and split them into shaders and general and specific patterns. And then we chose various creation methods and placement methods for all of our patterns. So up here we have the metal, which is down here. This is metal for the arm, but it's similar for all the other metals. So the metal material itself is Brazil 2 Advanced, set to Brazil Default. And the reflection is glossy. And then in the color, we have a multi-ID map. So we have one of these switchers, and using material IDs, it places one of these 4 maps on the different pieces in the model. And each one of these is a composite map, which contains both a blended box map here, which is then multiplied by a value, which is these solid colors, to achieve the 4 different shades. So then under bump we have another blended box map, and the environment is our HDR, which is over here. And then under reflectivity and reflection tint we have more switchers. In this case we switch between a bunch of different fall-off maps set to Fresnel and given a different IOR. And then these ones here are all identical to each other. They're all white except for this one that tints the reflections to be gold colored because this is the golden material. So now we'll quickly move on to the painted metal, which is on the back dumpster. So at the very lowest level we have our metal material, which is very similar to this metal material, except I took out all the switcher stuff since we only really needed one metal over the entire surface. So up one more level is a blend, and this is blending between the metal and the paint. And the paint is using, over in here, a color-corrected blended box map. Then this is being overlaid on top of the paint color. Then in the bump we have another blended box map, which is our brush pattern. The environment is our HDR again. The reflectivity is a fall off set to a much lower value so that the paint is not nearly as reflective as the metal is. Then we have our paint mask, and the paint mask is a mixture of the more procedural stuff we did by using that script to bake the edges into the vertex map and then warping it with noise, and the hand-painted stuff, which is inside of here. And this stuff is I used the 6-sided blended box map to do something similar to projections. So we now go up one more level, and that blend is in itself another blend. And the thing we're blending it with is the graphics mat. And the graphics, as you remember, are a blended box map, which I'm using to do projection. And then that's in the color, and the bump is a very simple brushstroke bump again. And we have the HDR in the environment, and we have a much higher reflectivity on this so that the graphics are more reflective than the regular paint. Then under the mask, I have the same six-sided set of projections that I had in the color. And the reason I can do this is because inside of each one of these bitmaps, I have it set to mono channel output alpha, RGB channel output RGB, and alpha source image alpha. And so what this does is if it's being used inside of a color, it'll use the color of the image, and if it's being used inside of a mask, it then is going to grab the mono channel, which is set to alpha. And so that's how I can use exactly the same map trees in here and also in the color of here and get the right result. So the map blend is in another blend, and this is the rust material, and the rust is a color-corrected blended box map of the rust and a procedural for the bump. And the mask is the rust mask, which we painted using the six-sided blended box map. Then one more level up we have the dirt, and the dirt is just like the graphics. So we have in here a blended box map doing projections, and that's doing the color, and then I'm using exactly the same bitmap in the mask. However, this one grabs the alpha channels from the images instead of the color of the images. Then all of that is in a Brazil 2 utility material, and the reason I do that is so I can apply a single bump map over top of everything else, and that's the bump map that does the waviness so that our reflections look more like real reflections on a flat surface. So as you can see here, we used XYZ space for some of the procedurals. We used a blended box map. We didn't use ambient occlusion. We don't have a curvature map, but we did use a vertex paint trick to do something similar to curvature. We didn't use a reference object, and we used a switcher. And then for placement on the specific patterns, we used specific UV space for the road, and we used projected UVs for the road as well. We didn't use camera mapping. We didn't technically use projections, but we did use a six-sided blended box map to pretend that I was doing a projection. We didn't use 3D paint. We used vertex paint, but only as we did to make a curvature map. And then environment mapping we used for all of the reflections. And pattern creation-wise, we used all three. So we used procedurals, painting, and photo manipulation. We used all these combined. Then we used primarily the material layering technique to layer in the shaders and all these to get our final result. So a few useful statistics. First of all, the actual time it took me to complete the shading and texturing was about 45 hours. And that includes all the shading and all the general and specific patterns, which is about 5 regular workdays worth of work. Also, the model is 3 million faces unsmoothed and 12 million smoothed, which is certainly a lot of faces, but for a hero robot character, that's not unheard of these days, especially for film projects. And the same for the number of objects. It's about just over 2,000 objects, but I know some robot characters for film that get up in the range of 10,000 objects, so this really isn't all that crazy in comparison. Finally, here are some potential improvements to the techniques I showed you in this DVD that may happen in the future, or are things that you can try yourself. So first of all, if we had a real Cook torrent shader, that would be really useful for making our metals, but as it stands, we had to use something more akin to a Lambert with a blend. Then if we had a real blended box map built into Max, we wouldn't have the really complex map trees to get the blended effect along with all the UV map modifiers. Instead, we could have it as a single modifier and we'd be done. Also, if the camera map allowed for orthographic projection, and if the aspect ratio was separate from the final render, we could then use the camera map to do our projections instead of having to use the sort of six-sided blended box map trick. Also, it would be nice to have a real curvature map, because if we had that, we wouldn't need to bake the edges into the vertex map on the objects. Also, I didn't put spec maps specifically in any of the materials, and the reason I did that was because you end up getting a lot of variety in the specularity of the surface from the fact that you're blending all these materials that each have a different reflectivity. But you could also add on top of that even more variation. So for example, your original paint material could have a spec map to vary the level of paint that goes on, as opposed to just relying on the different materials to provide the different levels of specularity. Also, if you stare really closely at rust, a lot of rust is actually a little bit more specifically colored in specific spots. So for example, sometimes you'll sort of have a lighter rust around the darker rust interior. And for this particular example, I just negated that, and I just used a blended box map general pattern to make the rust color. But if you wanted to, you could also turn the rust color into a specific pattern and add those little details in there by hand. And then finally, you could also, if you wanted to, you could use the general pattern method to set up your original general patterns, and then use the render to texture feature to then go in and hand paint on top of the general pattern. So that way you could do more of your mixing inside of Photoshop while still using the blended box maps to do your original general patterns. And that's it. So thank you very much for watching. And I hope you learned something, and I hope the material in here is something that you can use when it comes time to make your own projects. So thank you very much, and I'll see you later.